Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, there's a place where time refuses to follow its natural course. The trees grow twisted and gnarled, birds refuse to fly over certain valleys, and locals take hour-long detours rather than pass a particular ridge because of a structure that appeared without warning in the autumn of 1902, a stone chapel that no one saw being built, but was simply there one October morning. Before diving into the deep, like, subscribe and comment below from where are you watch asterisk. The Blue Ridge has always been a land of mystery, mountains swallowed in perpetual mist, deep hollows where fog pools like standing water, and isolated communities that guard their secrets fiercely. It was wild country where civilization barely had a foothold, where roads were little more than cart paths, and news traveled at a crawl. It was into this world that the chapel materialized, built in stark Gothic style. The structure featured a bell tower that rose like an accusatory finger toward heaven. It stood atop Raven's Peak, an isolated summit ringed by ancient hemlocks. Its windows were narrow slits, and the stone used in its construction had an unusual dark, almost black quality that contrasted sharply with the green wilderness surrounding it. Samuel Garrett, a cattle farmer, was first to report the structure. He passed that peak weekly to check his herds in the high pastures, and he swore on his life that the previous week there had been nothing there, just trees and rock. But on that cold October morning, the chapel stood as if it had always existed. Samuel described the scene to neighbors at the general store. He'd stood paralyzed for several minutes, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. There were no signs of recent construction, no lumber scraps, no abandoned tools, no disturbed earth. The ground was untouched, covered in the same moss and fallen leaves. Only the structure itself was different, solid, imposing, its entrance sealed by rusty chains that looked centuries old. But what truly disturbed Samuel wasn't the chapel's sudden appearance, it was the sound. Even from a distance he could hear bells ringing, a slow, mournful tolling that echoed through the mountains with unnatural clarity. The problem was that as he drew closer, he realized there was no wind. The air hung completely still, heavy as lead. Yet the bells continued their relentless ringing. In the following days, other residents confirmed the story. The chapel was there, inexplicable and somber, and the bells rang at specific times, dawn, dusk, and midnight, 3 times daily in a constant rhythm that seemed to follow some hidden purpose. The local community reacted with equal parts fear and fascination. Some believed the building had been erected by a secret religious sect working under cover of darkness. Others whispered of darker forces, of pacts sealed in forgotten places. Some said the peak had always been cursed, and the chapel was merely a physical manifestation of something that had waited there since time immemorial. Pastor Benjamin Crawford of the town's Presbyterian Church decided to investigate. He was a man of strong faith and practical mind who didn't believe in superstitions. For him, there was a rational explanation for everything, and he was determined to find it. He gathered 5 brave men, and on a gray November afternoon they climbed toward the mysterious building. They carried tools to force entry, oil lamps, and enough courage to face the unknown. But when they reached the summit and stood before the main door, something changed. The air grew colder, denser. A strange smell emanated from within, something they couldn't identify. It was like ancient stone mixed with damp earth and something else, something organic and deeply unsettling. Pastor Crawford tested the chains, examining their strength. They were solid, secured by a padlock that looked decades old. As he studied the lock, the bells began ringing again, but differently this time. Not the regular, predictable tolling. This was erratic, desperate, as if someone inside were frantically pulling the ropes. The men instinctively retreated. One of them, a logger named William Nash, suggested they return another day, better prepared. But the pastor was determined. He'd promised the community answers, and he wouldn't return empty-handed. He ordered William to use his axe on the padlock. The metal gave way with a crack that echoed through the silent forest. The chains fell to the ground with a heavy, final sound. The door remained closed for a moment, as if reluctant to open. Then slowly it began to swing inward, creaking on hinges that shouldn't have functioned after so long. What they saw on the other side would change everything. The darkness beyond the door was unnatural. Even with their lamps lit, the light seemed to be swallowed by something invisible, creating only small circles of illumination that barely revealed the stone floor beneath their feet. The chapel's interior was larger than seemed possible from the outside. A central aisle flanked by perfectly aligned pews, all facing an altar at the far end. Pastor Crawford took the first step inside, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. The other men followed hesitantly, keeping close together. The silence inside was absolute, oppressive, the kind that presses on the ears and makes the heart pound. No sound from outside penetrated those walls. The pews were covered in a thin layer of dust, but there were no cobwebs, no signs of animals. It was as if even the simplest creatures knew this place should be avoided. The walls were carved with symbols. None of them recognized complex geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. William Nash pointed his lamp at the ceiling, and everyone followed his gaze. There, suspended by ropes descending through holes in the structure, hung 3 bronze bells. They swayed slightly, despite the absence of any breeze, and lamplight reflected strangely off their polished surfaces, creating patterns that danced across the walls. The group moved slowly down the central corridor. Their footsteps echoed in a distorted way. Sound seemed to return from impossible angles, as if the interior space didn't obey normal laws of acoustics. One man, a blacksmith named Richard Stone, commented in a low voice that he felt watched. The others silently agreed, all feeling the weight of invisible gazes on their necks. As they approached the altar, the temperature dropped further. Pastor Crawford could see his breath condensing into dense clouds. The altar itself was simple gray stone, but upon it rested an enormous book bound in dark leather. Beside the book was a candelabra with candles that were impossibly lit. This made no sense. The chapel was locked, abandoned, yet there were candles burning as if someone had lit them moments before. The pastor reached out to touch the book, but William grabbed his arm, warning that touching anything might be unwise. Crawford ignored him. He needed to understand. The book's pages were thick yellowed parchment covered in elaborate writing in black ink. The handwriting was impeccable, but the language was unknown. It wasn't Latin, nor Old English, nor any language the pastor recognized. The letters formed hypnotic patterns, and the more he looked, the more he felt his mind wandering to dark places. Richard noticed something disturbing. The shadows on the wall behind the altar didn't correspond to the position of the lamps. They moved independently, stretching and contracting as if alive. When he pointed this out, they all instinctively recoiled that it was time to leave. But when they turned back, they discovered the door they'd entered through was no longer visible. The central corridor seemed to stretch endlessly in the direction they'd come, disappearing into darkness their lamps couldn't penetrate. Panic began to set in. William screamed, trying to find an exit. His voice echoed strangely, returning to them as if from underwater. The others joined him, running down the corridor, but no matter how far they advanced, the pews kept appearing on either side, identical and endless. They were trapped in an impossible loop. Then the bells began ringing again, but now the sound didn't come from above. It came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls, the floor, their very bones. The ringing was deafening, chaotic. Carrying a sense of desperate urgency, Pastor Crawford fell to his knees, covering his ears. Through the deafening sound, he perceived something that terrified him more than anything else. The bells weren't just ringing, they were calling, and something was answering. From the back of the chapel, where the darkness was densest, shapes emerged. They weren't solid enough to be seen clearly, but they were definitely real. Silhouettes that moved with purpose, gliding between pews toward the terrified group. They made no sound other than the bells, but their presence was undeniable. Richard pulled the pastor up, and the men rushed forward with renewed desperation. This time, miraculously, the door appeared before them. Light from outside seemed like salvation itself. They threw themselves through the opening and rolled across the grass, breathing fresh air like shipwrecked sailors. Finally reaching shore, the door slammed shut behind them with a bang that shook the earth. When they looked back, the chains were intact again, as if never broken. The padlock was in place, rusty and impossible to open. They descended the peak in absolute silence. None could fully process what had just happened. When they reached town and tried to recount the experience, words failed them. How could they describe something that defied all logic and reason? Pastor Crawford gathered the community that night and made a solemn pronouncement. The chapel on Raven's Peak was to be avoided at all costs. No one should attempt entry again. It was a place that belonged to something beyond human comprehension, and it was best left alone. But this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to unravel the secrets of that mysterious building. The bells would continue ringing, relentlessly marking time, waiting for the next visitor curious enough to ignore the warnings. The following months brought palpable change to the region. The community had learned to coexist with the chapel's presence, maintaining respectful distance. Farmers modified their routes. Hunters avoided that specific area. Families taught their children never to approach that peak, but fear, however genuine, eventually fades. As time passed, Pastor Crawford's story began to be questioned. Some suggested the group had suffered collective hallucination, perhaps from natural gases. Others believed it was amplified around the fire to entertain and frighten it. Was in this the climate of growing skepticism that Catherine Mitchell arrived in spring 1903. She was a painter from Philadelphia, seeking inspiration in Virginia's wild landscapes. Catherine had a curious and fearless nature, qualities that had led her to explore places others avoided. When she heard about the abandoned chapel, her interest was immediately piqued. Locals tried to dissuade her. They told stories, described disturbing experiences, warned of dangers. But Catherine interpreted it all as rural superstition, fascinating folklore she didn't take seriously. To her, the chapel was just an old structure haunted by people's imaginations, not by any real supernatural force. On a clear April morning, Catherine set off alone toward the peak, carrying her easel, paints, and canvases. Her plan was simple: paint the chapel in natural light, capture its peculiar architecture, perhaps even venture inside to sketch the interior. It would be, she thought, the centerpiece of her new collection. The climb was peaceful. Birds sang in the trees, The breeze was gentle and fragrant with wildflowers. Nothing suggested danger or mystery. When Catherine finally reached the summit and saw the building, she was struck by its somber beauty. The dark stone contrasted magnificently with the blue sky, and the Gothic lines possessed an elegance she hadn't expected. She set up her easel at a safe distance and began to work, her brushstrokes quick and confident. She was so absorbed that she didn't immediately notice when the bells began to ring. When she finally registered the sound, she looked up with curiosity rather than fear. The sound was different from what residents had described, not threatening or chaotic, but almost melodic, like an old forgotten song. Catherine found it curiously relaxing. She continued painting, letting the ringing create a rhythm for her work. Only when the sun began dipping toward the horizon did Catherine realize how much time had passed. She'd completed not one but 3 paintings from different angles. Each captured the structure uniquely, revealing details she hadn't consciously noticed while working. But there was something strange about the paintings. Looking at them now, Catherine could see that in each one there was a figure in the tower windows, a dark silhouette, vaguely human, watching from inside. She frowned, confused. She was certain she hadn't painted that intentionally. Her hands must have moved automatically, adding that detail without her conscious mind registering it. Intrigued and somewhat disturbed, Catherine decided to approach the chapel to investigate. Perhaps there really was someone inside, some wanderer who had found shelter. The chains on the door were exactly as described, rusty and seemingly ancient. Catherine examined them with an artist's eye, noting the patterns of oxidation, the way light cast shadows through the metal links. She walked around the structure, searching for other entrances. All were firmly closed or too high to reach. But at the back of the chapel, she found something interesting, a small side door partially hidden by overgrown brush. Unlike the main entrance, this one had no chains. Catherine hesitated. The locals' warnings echoed in her mind, but curiosity was stronger. She was a woman of reason, science, and art. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. The doorknob turned easily under her hand. The door opened without resistance, revealing a narrow hallway leading inside. A draft of cold air escaped, carrying that peculiar smell Pastor Crawford had mentioned. Catherine lit her lantern and stepped inside. The hallway was narrow, walls seemingly leaning inward, creating a feeling of oppression. Her boots made hollow sounds against the stone floor, each step echoing strangely. She kept one hand on the wall for guidance, feeling carved symbols beneath her fingers, those strange patterns covering every surface. After several meters, the corridor opened into the main hall. Catherine emerged near the altar, exactly where the pastor and his men had stood months before. The book was still there, the candles still burning with unwavering flames. She approached slowly, her breath visible in the icy air. Unlike the pastor, Catherine didn't try to read the book. Instead, she observed it as she would any artistic object, appreciating the craftsmanship, the beauty of the binding. Then she noticed something the others had missed. The pages weren't just covered in texts, there were illustrations in the margins, intricate drawings forming a visual narrative. The illustrations depicted a sequence, a building being erected, people gathering, bells being hung. Then something changed. The figures in the images began to distort, transforming into forms no longer entirely human. The narrative ended with an image of the chapel itself, isolated atop a peak, its bells ringing eternally. Catherine felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a story here, something that had happened in this place long ago, and whatever that story was, it wasn't over. The bells above her head began to ring again, and this time she understood. They weren't just bells, they were a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Catherine stood motionless before the altar, her heart racing as the bells filled every inch of space around her. But unlike the pastor's group, she felt no panic. There was something almost hypnotic in the way the sound reverberated, creating layers of harmony that seemed to tell a wordless story. She picked up her sketchbook and began drawing frantically. Her hands moved almost of their own accord, capturing the symbols on walls, the strange proportions of the chapel's interior, the way shadows behaved impossibly. Each stroke seemed to reveal something new, as if drawing were a way of translating a language she didn't know she understood. Minutes turned into hours. Light streaming through narrow windows shifted from golden afternoon to deep amber twilight. Catherine was completely absorbed, filling page after page with images that flowed effortlessly from mind to paper. Only when darkness began to completely engulf the interior did she finally stop. She looked around, disoriented, as if waking from a deep dream. Her lantern had gone out some time ago, but strangely she could still see. The candles on the altar emitted light that seemed stronger than possible, casting a silvery glow that didn't behave like natural light. Catherine flipped through the pages she'd filled and felt a wave of surprise. The drawings were extraordinary, technically perfect, but they weren't her usual style. The hand that had created them seemed to belong to someone from another century, using techniques she recognized from ancient manuscripts but had never formally studied. And then she saw it. In each drawing, each sketch, there was a hidden pattern, lines connecting from page to page, forming a map. Not a geographical map, but something more abstract. a map of connections, of relationships between this place and something larger, something extending beyond the Blue Ridge, beyond Virginia, perhaps beyond the tangible world. A soft sound pulled her from her thoughts. Footsteps. Someone was walking down the chapel's central aisle, coming from the main entrance. Catherine turned quickly, heart racing, but no one was in sight. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, drawing closer to where she stood. She instinctively recoiled, pressing against the wall behind the altar. The footsteps stopped exactly where the middle of the aisle should be. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy as stone. Catherine held her breath, scanning the dim light for movement. Then she saw it, not a person. Not exactly. It was a presence, something that occupied space without having solid form. A density in the air, a distortion in the candlelight, and it was watching her with an attention she could physically feel, like pressure against her skin. Catherine forced herself to breathe, to remain calm. She was a rational person. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps exhaustion, lack of fresh air, the oppressive atmosphere playing tricks on her senses. But deep down she knew she was trying to convince herself of something she no longer believed. The presence began to move again, not walking, but flowing, gliding through space in a way that defied physics. It approached the altar, and Catherine realized she could see through it. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't completely immaterial either. It existed in some intermediate state, trapped between what was real and what shouldn't be possible. To her own astonishment, Catherine didn't run. Something inside her, that same curiosity that had drawn her to the chapel, kept her there. She watched as the presence positioned itself on the other side of the altar, mirroring her posture. And then, slowly, it began to take shape. The outlines became more defined, revealing the silhouette of a human figure, enveloped in something that could be a cloak or simply solidified shadows. Where the face should have been, there was only darkness, but Catherine had the unmistakable feeling. She was being studied with the same intensity with which she studied the apparition. The figure extended what might have been a hand toward the book on the altar. The pages began turning on their own, sheet after sheet, until they stopped at a specific section. The illustration on that page showed a figure very similar to the one standing before Catherine, on a pulpit, surrounded by other indistinct shapes. Catherine understood somehow, instinctively, that she was being shown a memory. This place had once been different. It had been a real chapel, with a congregation, with purpose. But something had happened, some transformation that had changed everything. Those who had frequented this place had become part of it, trapped within its walls, echoing through time. The figure then pointed to another drawing several pages later. This image showed the chapel in flames, with figures fleeing in all directions. But the fire in the illustration wasn't red or orange. It was black, consuming light instead of producing it. And in the center of the impossible blaze, the tower remained intact, the bells still visible against the chaos. Catherine felt a cold realization forming in her mind. This place hadn't been built. It had been transformed. Something terrible had happened here. Something that had altered the very nature of the structure, turning it into something that existed partially outside normal laws of reality. The bells began to toll again. But now Catherine could hear something behind the metallic sound. Voices, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all merged into the chimes. They weren't cries of agony or celebratory chants. They were simply presences, marking their existence in the only way they still could. The figure before her began to dissipate, its edges dissolving like smoke in a breeze. But before disappearing completely, it gestured one last time toward the side door through which Catherine had entered. The message was clear. It was time to leave. Catherine didn't need to be warned twice. She quickly gathered her belongings, stuffing her sketchbook in her bag. As she passed the altar on her way out, she took one last look at the book. The pages had turned back to the beginning, as if nothing had happened. But she knew everything had changed. She had seen something few saw and survived to tell. The narrow corridor seemed longer on the way back, the walls closer. Catherine quickened her pace, eager to feel night air on her face. When she finally emerged through the side door, the moon was high in the sky, casting silvery light over the peak. She didn't look back as she descended, but she could feel the weight of the chapel behind her, eternal, guarding its secrets. And in the silence of the night, very soft but unmistakable, she could still hear the bells ringing. Catherine didn't sleep that night. Back at the small boarding house where she was staying, she spread all her drawings across the bed and floor, trying to understand what she'd captured. Each image seemed to contain layers of meaning that only revealed themselves when viewed from certain angles or under particular light. The landlady, an elderly woman named Rose, brought tea in the morning and froze in the doorway upon seeing the drawings. Her face paled, and the teacup trembled in her hands. Catherine noticed her reaction and asked what was wrong. Rose simply shook her head, set the tray down, and left quickly, muttering something about not getting involved with such things. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable change in the townspeople's attitude toward Catherine. They greeted her politely but kept their distance. Conversations ceased when she entered the general store. Furtive glances followed her along the dirt streets. She had crossed an invisible line by entering that chapel, and now she carried a mark others could feel, even if they couldn't see. but Catherine was far from intimidated. If anything, the experience had ignited a flame of determination within her. She began asking careful questions of the few residents who still spoke with her. She wanted to know about the region's history, about who had lived in the mountains before the current generation, about any unusual events that might explain the chapel's origins. Through these fragmented conversations, she pieced together an incomplete narrative decades earlier. Perhaps in the 1870s or before, that area had been inhabited by an isolated group who practiced a particular form of faith. They were neither Presbyterian nor Methodist nor any known denomination. They kept to themselves, built their own structures, followed their own calendars. An old hunter loosened by drink told Catherine his grandfather used to mention that group. He said they had a different understanding of reality's nature, of boundaries between visible and invisible worlds. They held meetings to the sound of bells, believing certain frequencies could open passages to other states of existence. Catherine absorbed each fragment like an archaeologist piecing together a broken vase. The pieces didn't fit perfectly, but they were forming a picture. That chapel wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a focal point, a place where something had been attempted and perhaps succeeded. Though the result wasn't what its creators had hoped for, she decided to return. Not during day when her presence would be noticed and hindered, but at nightfall, when shadows lengthened and the world took on different quality. This time she'd be prepared with more lanterns, more supplies, and ironclad determination to document everything she encountered. On the chosen night, the sky was overcast with no moon or stars visible. The darkness was almost tangible, swallowing the path ahead. Catherine followed more by memory than sight, her feet finding the way by instinct. The silence of the forest was complete. No animal moved, no insect sang. When she reached the summit, the chapel stood like a dark outline against a slightly less dark sky. No light emanated from it, but Catherine could swear the structure seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. Like a gigantic lung dot, she returned to the side door, expecting to find it unlocked as before. But this time, when she turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. It was firmly closed, resisting all her efforts. Catherine frowned, confused. She tried pushing with her shoulder, but it was like trying to move a solid wall. Then she heard it, the sound of chains being dragged. It came from the front of the chapel, from the main entrance. Catherine cautiously circled the structure and met a sight that left her speechless. The chains that had been fastened for so long lay on the ground, forming a perfect circle. The door was ajar, a silent invitation. She hesitated. This was different from her previous visit. The first time she'd found a secondary entrance that seemed almost accidental. But now the chapel itself was opening its main door to her. It was a deliberate invitation. And Catherine couldn't decide whether it made her feel honored or terrified. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and entered. The interior was bathed in that same impossible silvery light, emanating from no source and from all sources at once. The pews, the aisle, the altar, everything was exactly as she remembered. But something was different. The air seemed heavy with expectation, as if the space itself were waiting. Catherine walked slowly down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in ways that no longer surprised her. When she reached the altar, she saw the book was open to a page she didn't recognize. The illustration showed a solitary figure standing exactly where she was now, surrounded by symbols that pulsed with life of their own. The bells began to ring, but the sound was different this time. Not random chiming or melancholy tolling. It was a precise sequence, a mathematical pattern that repeated and evolved. Catherine recognized the structure from somewhere deep within her consciousness. It was music, but of a kind not meant for human ears. Around her, space began to shift. The walls seemed to recede, expanding the interior to impossible dimensions. The pews multiplied, filling with translucent forms, echoes of a congregation that no longer existed in conventional ways. They weren't looking at Catherine, but all were turned toward the altar, waiting, always waiting. Catherine felt dizziness take hold of her, not physical, but existential. She was seeing beyond what she was supposed to see, understanding connections the human mind wasn't designed to process. Present, past, and perhaps even possible futures overlapped in that space, all existing simultaneously. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The bells fell silent. The translucent forms vanished. Space returned to normal dimensions. Catherine was alone again, standing before the altar with only the eternal candles for company. But she was no longer afraid. She had passed some kind of test or experience and emerged on the other side, transformed. She looked at her hands and saw they were trembling not with terror, but with strange excitement. There was so much more to understand, so much more to discover. She left the chapel that night with more questions than answers. But now she knew there was a purpose to it all. The chapel wasn't just a remnant of something that had ended badly. It was something that continued, evolving, waiting.
Scene: a dark Gothic stone chapel on top of a misty mountain peak. The chapel is made of black stone with a tall pointed bell tower. 3 bronze bells visible in the tower glowing with eerie light. Fog surrounds the mountain. Twilight sky with purple and blue colors. Character: a young woman painter in a long Victorian dress, early 1900s style, standing in the foreground looking up at the chapel. She's holding an artist's easel and canvas. Her expression shows curiosity and fear. Key details: chapel door slightly open with broken chains on the ground, mysterious silver light coming from narrow windows, twisted dead trees around the chapel, winding path leading up to the building, dark, moody atmosphere. Style: Gothic horror, dark and atmospheric, Victorian era, supernatural mystery. Colors: black stone, white fog, purple blue sky, silver mysterious glow, warm lantern light.